We're going to begin with a segment on African American art, and we will be starting with the Harlem Renaissance, which is the most prominent African American movement of the early 20th century, located in the United States. Its heartland is Harlem in New York City. That's the northeast part of Manhattan Island. And it begins following the destruction and end of World War I. With that comes a sense of new beginnings and optimism, in particular for African Americans. This is called a renaissance, to be reborn, essentially. In this case, the Renaissance references turning to the past, and this past in particular is Africa. And African art, which is going to provide a great amount of influence on Harlem Renaissance artists. The artists in Harlem in this period were in absolutely all areas, not just in painting. And I do have one of the leaders, Aaron Douglas, on the screen right now. But I am talking about everything. Writers, poets, philosophers, musicians, actors, painters, educators, scientists. It was like there was electricity in the air, and everybody's creative juices were flowing. Harlem, in this time period, became a center of Black culture. The creative thinkers and doers were drawing from the experiences of their African heritage, as well as the history of slavery in the United States. And also, I think, the energy of city life. Since many African Americans were now living in cities, many of them, in fact, had migrated from the South to the North. In this time period, there were fewer European immigrants, so there were many more jobs available, jobs that needed to be filled after the war. There was also a need to build factories and industry and infrastructure. So there were a lot of opportunities leading to movement to cities, the energy and cultural resources that come along with city living. In the Harlem Renaissance, there is no single style. The only thing I can really say is that it would function as a common denominator is a sense of pride. Everybody seems to celebrate African American culture and potential. It is also an opportunity to display and promote African American culture. This would be the place, I think, where our artists are the first to create an American voice. It is a visual vocabulary for Black Americans. And generally considered to be a leader is Aaron Douglas, who is the best known of the Harlem Renaissance artists. Mr. Douglas, in a photograph on the left, I'm going to say was kind of fortunate because he met the Philadelphia collector Albert Barnes. And Barnes, as probably most of you know, had a really impressive modern as well as African art, Western collection of materials. And he allowed Aaron Douglas to actually use that as source material. So we know that Aaron Douglas had an opportunity to study Barnes's West African sculpture and also his modern art, which included pieces by Matisse and Picasso. And some of the characteristics, particularly I think from Picasso, come across in the style of Aaron Douglas. The piece that's on the right is just an intro slide. It is called Into Bondage, which of course is a reference to slavery in the New World. But the broad planes and bold forms suggest influence both from Africa and also from Picasso and Cubism. This, excuse me, this is the slide that we have, and actually we have a lot of details, page 932, located in Gardner, and it is panel 3 of a series of 4 very large panels, narrative series, that give us aspects, this is Douglas's title, aspects of Negro life. It is a story essentially saying where, who we are, where we come from, and also it ends by suggesting where we might be going, a kind of future and an optimism that is a part of this. It was intended to be read like a book. And I do want to stress strongly the storytelling aspect of many of the artists associated with the Harlem Renaissance, particularly with Douglass. And I would like to suggest that this comes from an African oral tradition, and I'm talking about the continent of Africa. In the pre-colonial period, there was no writing on the continent, and the oral tradition was very strong. I do believe that comes to the United States, where even today some of our very, very best storytellers are African Americans. So we carry over into our art a sense of narrative, and that's going to be true for Mr. Douglass. This is a document, essentially an historical document that tells a story. And again, I would like to suggest that you go ahead and you read it like a book from left to right. This is the third panel in the history of African Americans in the United States. And this particular panel goes from slavery through emancipation. Okay, as we take a look at this, we can see that the foundation of life in the New World was in fact based on cotton. All of that white puffy stuff that runs across the bottom, I'd say 4/5 of the way, going from right to left. There is also a reference to slavery and to downtrodden, controlled figures. If we go over here in this section of the painting, and remember we're reading from right to left, you can see a hunched figure. His shoulder runs along an angle, and that echoes two diagonals. Whoops, sorry about that. Two diagonals that run through the composition that help, in fact, to move us from left to right, almost as if we are reading a book, moving us from subservience over to freedom and to possibilities and aspirations. Okay, if you get onto the lower right, you're going to see one of the details, and you're going to see a broken chain, and that suggests the freedom that comes with emancipation. You're also going to see that this is laden with details in the background towards the a little bit left of center. The Union Army is retreating, hovering specter-like above them. There are references to the Klan, however, so we have good, we have bad. But overall, there is an incredible sense of destiny and potential for the future. The two figures who are circled with radiating light help to tell the story of this. The one at the far left, and that's this figure located right over here. This figure is holding the Emancipation Proclamation, and that gives freedom to African Americans. It's not as important as the guy who's located in the center, however, with the radiating disk of light, because he's holding the ballot, the vote, and he is pointing, in fact, to the Capitol, to Congress, essentially, and letting you know as African Americans what you really need to do is take advantage of your rights and use the ballot to gain political voice and to use it with a sense of pride. All of this is conveyed in an epic format. It's 11.5 feet across, so it's a very big picture. It is a narrative sequence, and it talks about creating an identity and documenting the aspirations of African Americans. Okay. We have a couple more details of this located on the left. I'd like you to be thinking about the style, the appearance of the works that Douglass creates, and that would apply also to the one that's in our book, Figure 39A, Noah's Ark. His images tend to be very simplified, stylized. The space is compressed. There are subdued colors in the compositions, both of them epic and monumental with very broad, flat forms. They're also incredibly linear with crisp, clear outlines, very, very precise edges. Some of this comes from The very crisp, clear edges of West African sculpture and the strong silhouettes. Some of this comes from looking at modernism in the form of cubism, and in particular, the cutouts that were being created by Picasso as he cut paper and put it on collages, which gives a very crisp, clear edge. Before leaving panel 3, I would like you to take a look at the figure lower left, raised arms, and that figure, kind of a dancing figure, is next to the musician. For Douglass and for many African Americans, music itself, particularly jazz, which provided such a strong contribution to American life, was a sign of the future and the success of African Americans. So as we move from the left to the right, we see that the painting ends with a great kind of optimistic sense of potential for future success in the United States. Okay, the Noah's Ark image. The individual figures might be easier to see, very powerful, very heroic, with broad, flat color areas, very linear, precise outlines, and restricted color, a kind of limited tonal range. I'd like you also to notice the very, very forceful gestures and very strong body language in these energized and heroic figures, and the very strong shoulders. And the reason I'd like you to see the strong shoulders is that that is going to carry over and influence Jacob Lawrence. These figures, in fact, and if we, excuse me, if we look at the image of Noah's Ark, maybe it's easiest to see, but these folks really almost look like superheroes, like they're action figures, and in the sense that they can also be inspirational and reassert ideas of pride and value associated with creativity coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. This is just to look at. It's an additional image. It's located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It follows the lines of what else we've been looking at. It's called Let My People Go, and it, of course, draws a parallel between the Old Testament story of Moses leading his enslaved people out of Egypt and using the line to the Egyptian Pharaoh, let my people go. It also is a reference, of course, to slavery in the United States. So drawing on a number of sources, and one of those sources is the history of slavery for African Americans. Jacob Lawrence can also be associated with the Harlem Renaissance, although he comes in a little bit later. I want to claim him for our own because he was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey. His family is going to move to Philadelphia before it moves to Harlem, so I feel like he's one of ours. He will come in as a very young person, but he's still going to benefit from the creative spirit. We tend to talk about the Harlem Renaissance running from the end of World War I to the Great Depression. But trust me, creativity does not stop when the stock market collapses. It's going to continue, and Jacob Lawrence is going to benefit from being surrounded by very, very creative people. One of the most important influences for him will be Aaron Douglas, and he did meet Aaron Douglas. Jacob Lawrence, was also well aware of the international art market and knew the works of Picasso, of the Cubists, and of the Mexican muralists as well. He also was aware of African art. He's a pretty important American artist who achieves fame and fortune in his lifetime. That's him on the left. He will also be a teacher, so he's going to influence the next generation of students, of American art students in the 20th century. I've selected to show us a piece not in our book. It is from the Harriet Tubman series. It is number 7 in that series. It too tells a narrative, it tells a story, and it tells it in 31 separate narrative panels, all about the same size and all made with largely the same material. It tells the life of Harriet Tubman. The reason I've picked Harriet Tubman is, well, she's an important player in American history. But in addition to that, she's about to go on the $20 bill. There's been some controversy about the slowness of this actually taking place. But I understand that in the near future, you're actually going to be seeing Harriet Tubman replacing Andrew Jackson. So we need to know something about her. Who was Harriet Tubman? Harriet Tubman was a slave born in Maryland, 1821. She escaped slavery at the age of 21 and helps to move other slaves using the Underground Railroad, takes them from the south to the north. We think that she helped over 300 slaves to escape to freedom, and believe that she so annoyed the plantation owners that in 1855 they put a $40,000 reward out on her. That's a bounty on her head, folks. And in 1855, $40,000 is really a substantial amount. So it gives you a little sense of the notoriety that Harriet Tubman had achieved. The panels that Jacob Lawrence produced tell her story, including the time that she was a slave, and that's what we're looking at right here. She's working, and she's actually cutting wood, so that is essentially her job. She's a figure who looks very, very strong. Part of the reason for that is she fills the frame of the painting, so she's almost bursting out of the edges. A very large figure, large muscular arms, and hands that are exaggerated. She has incredibly broad shoulders that meet at 90-degree angles. She is built like a piece of architecture. So we get an emphasis on her muscularity, her power, but that carries over to her spiritual strength and her courage. The thing that's kind of cool about this is she's actually an abstract figure. She's got a kerchief over her face, so she's anonymous. She could be any slave. She could be any person who's being forced into servitude or who is struggling against odds that are difficult to overcome. And it becomes an image then about the strength of her, not just her body, but the strength of her will at the same time. It's very simplified. We've got a very strong silhouette, stark, clear outlines. It's linear with flat, abstract shapes and color areas. Again, I'd like you to remind you it's a little bit like a cutout. And I think both Douglas and Lawrence were aware of synthetic cubism, which began to create collages. Very angular, very solid, with a cramped space that makes this figure look monumental. This is one in a series. The detail on the bottom is from the top right, which is another image from the series of the story of Harriet Tubman. This is typical, I think, of Lawrence again. He gives us a kind of, excuse me, sweeping, curving line that suggests the figure's all moving forward as Harriet is pushing forward a male slave. This is Harriet leading slaves out of the south to the north. You'll notice that Harriet is holding a gun. That gun, which became, I'm going to say, a legendary part of the story of Harriet Tubman, could be used against dogs tracking slaves, against bounty hunters seeking slaves. It could also be used, it is said, for slaves who got frightened along the way and wanted to give up and go back to the plantation. So Harriet, with that gun, represents the determination of someone to escape to freedom. The one that's on the left, we're going to see a bit in the future. This is by Elizabeth Catlett, another African-American artist. This is her interpretation of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, then, as an important figure within the history of African Americans in the United States. The bottom detail is, I just have the title of it, Panel 9, and I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that in this narrative that Lawrence is giving us, he gives a title to the series, but he also gives a title to each panel, and he uses words to describe what is going on. And the words here are, arise, flee for your life. So he's actually using part of the oral tradition, part of storytelling, and linking words with the images that he's depicting. Okay, another one of the panels from the Harriet Tubman series, just to look at the rhythmic repetition, the clear outlines, the broad patches of color. There is a rhythm, there is a sense of unity. This, of course, is a reference to being enslaved and being chained. Okay. This is what these look like. These are not that large, but they are a part of a story, and very much you should think of them as a book where you turn one page and go to the next one, which is a part of the sequence of the history. Okay. Let me end with Lawrence, the storyteller, with a series he did on the theme of builders. He created these images over a 17-year period. They are examples of honest labor, and he created them to promote social and political change by framing African Americans in positive roles as individuals who are making contributions to American society. Again, we have the carpenter on the left, we have the sewer or the seamstress on the right of the composition. Both of these are figures that tend to fill up the frame with large arms, broad shoulders, and angular bodies. The carpenter is the one I guess I'd like to focus on. He's holding a carpenter's square, and that would be used, or T-square, carpenter's square, which would be used to test for your angles to make sure that the thing that you are building is accurately constructed. Lawrence also used this tool to create the straight edges for that on his painting. And if you look closely, you'll see the lines extend from the painted image. Lawrence collected tools. He thought they were beautiful. And he had a respect for what humans could construct with them, for the potential coming from tools. And he also had a humanistic view of the potential for humans to create. These figures also are anonymous, so they can be anyone. They could be you, they could be me, they could be the African American carpenter at the time that Lawrence was creating this image. Again, very simplified, stark silhouette, borrowing from Douglas, and also almost certainly borrowing from modern European art in the period.